All right, recording has started. Al, would you like to say hello to start the meeting?
Well, all right. I'll introduce myself first very quickly, just to say I'm Al Ansaldua, Alfred Ansaldua, or Alfredo Ansaldua, depending on where you're coming from. I'm the Executive Vice President of the National Space Society. I'm also the chair of the Policy Committee of the National Space Society. And I'm also on the International Committee. And I've been since the mid 80s, I've been an activist, an advocate for space development.
Okay.
Next.
And Phyllis, let us know what's going on with the Phoenix chapter.
We're doing great. So excited to say that we just got an award with the NSS. We're very grateful, and so far we're just hanging tight with meetings and joining you guys, and we appreciate you having us here. Thank you.
Great. I am actually trying to find my introductory notes for Chris at the moment, and I'm not being successful, so I'm going to wing
Let's see. Okay.
Chris is an author of let me try and mute everybody for a moment here just to, God, I wish I knew how to do this better. Mute all, there we go. So anybody should be able to unmute themselves. For the purpose of this meeting, if you want to interrupt and ask a question, please put it in the chat either to everyone or to Al or Phyllis, and I'm going to be watching their screens to make sure that if there's a question that comes up, we can interrupt and ask from them. So Chris Impey, Distinguished Professor of Astronomy at the University of Arizona and author of 8 different books, one of which that attracted our attention for the purposes of this meeting is called Beyond Our Future in Space, and it was published in 2015. I got to read it this week, and so I have a few questions about how Chris would like to update a few things. But we're going to start off with a presentation from Chris. And Chris, you should be able to share your screen at this point. And if you can't, then let me know and we'll fix that.
Okay, we'll try that. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm pleased to be with you on a day when it's far too hot where we all are to be outside, so that's fine. That's pretty much been true for 2 months though, so nothing special about today. I got my exercise at 5 this morning. Let's see, okay, share screen. And my audio is fine if nobody says any, okay, good.
Doing good so far.
I'm using a legitimate mic just to make sure it was decent for this purpose rather than what's built into the laptop. Okay, so you should see my screen and...
Yes, we do.
Okay, and I will get going. So I picked a title which is really projecting where we are now into the next decade or so. That at some point we will go from the sort of buccaneering, pioneering flavor of space, mostly involving a couple of large governments in a geopolitical pissing contest for most of the history of it, into a different phase. And that phase is pretty much the industrialization of space, the projection of our economic activity into a new regime. And it'll happen, I think, actually quite quickly. And Ryan, I mean, many of you know a number of the things I'm going to say, so I'm going to go quite quickly over some material, maybe give a slightly different perspective on some issues. You know, sometimes it's hard to take a perspective view of something that's happening around us and all the time. And the long view, of course, is that, you know, for humans that have only been human for 50,000 years, have had civilization for about 10,000 years, and computers and modern technology for less than a century, this is a new activity for us. It's 60 years old or so, and mostly has been the work of just 2 countries. And that's all changing very rapidly. And that club of people who've been in orbit is around just over 600 people. And slightly depressingly for space fans, it's kind of sobering to recognize that it's almost half a century since we've been back to the only other place than the Earth that we've ever set foot. You know, for children growing up, looking at it, they're saying, really? You know, what happened with that? You know, where's this brave frontier if you stalled for half a century in that aspect? But I think, again, we have to take the long view. It was a rather strange inception of this activity because it was a little artificial, and now it's going into a different space. Also, we can't expect too much. If this projected forward, it would just continue to bumble around and go down. In current dollars, the budget of NASA has just been declining, and it's hard to do. People ding NASA, I think, for occasionally legitimate reasons, but for some unfair reasons. And the unfair reason is it's hard to do a lot with less. And these are hard, expensive activities. That extraordinary surge to a completely unsustainable fraction of GDP in the mid-60s obviously had to turn around. And of course, NASA's budget went into reverse even before the last the last moon landings were canceled and the cost of the Vietnam War became clear. So that was unsustainable. More depressing or more discouraging for space scientists and astronomers, as well as people who do the space activity, is that in the last 20 years, since the early 90s, NASA's budget in real terms has gone down by 50%. That's pretty rough. And that's its overall budget. The part of it that's used for propulsion research and space activities and shuttle launches and so on is a piece of that roughly $18.7 billion budget. And if you look across the world, you can see a country going in the opposite direction. The density of tick marks representing space launches by China is a crescendo through the present day. Their ambitions, as we know, are sizable. They want to do everything that the US has done and then some. They may indeed have started their space program by copying American technology, but now they're innovating in their own right. If you want a metric of Chinese space program, the average age of a NASA, the federal employees, not the contractors, but the federal workforce, the average age is 58. The average age of a Chinese aerospace worker is 28. So it's a completely different generation. It's a young, dynamic workforce. And of course, because the space program in China is melded with the geopolitical military activity, it's semi-secretive. So that creates anxiety of whether the Chinese will ever, dare or deign to put weapons in space, things that haven't been really contemplated for decades, and what their aspirations are beyond pure exploration and national pride. And clearly there's an enormous amount of Chinese national pride tied up in their space program. So that's an interesting trajectory. And it's essentially led already in the last 10 years for sure to a second space race, not with the Russians, Russia being a sort of moderately poor second world country at this point, but with China, which is a buoyant economy and a buoyant country. But what's new, of course, is the private sector. So again, the beginnings of this don't really tell what it's going to look like eventually, because when you have a few billionaires paying $20 million to go on a Soyuz for a week in the space station, and it's just a handful of people, essentially 8 or 9, it doesn't seem like something that's going to affect the world or change the world. I mean, if you're really rich like Charles Simonyi, you can add in another 15 and get a spacewalk. So, if you can afford 35 million for a long joyride and a spacewalk, good for you. Probably more indicative of how this transition has occurred is not the space billionaire tourists that were the first cohort, but the X Prize, which we all remember was modeled on the prize won by Charles Lindbergh. And like the prize that Lindbergh won, all the teams that competed for it spent way more than the prize to do the activity. So it's just one of those clever innovation ideas that spurs an activity. And so it was with this. We had Burt Rutan as the, probably the most brilliant airplane and spacecraft designer of the last century, and poached afterwards by Richard Branson for Virgin Galactic, doing the hard work to get the X Prize won. Then there was pretty much a failed effort. Not everything succeeds. The Google Moon Prize was not won, and the competition for that kind of filtered out quite drastically later on in the prize. It's now expired. But again, it makes people innovate. And the Google Moon Prize contestants were often just single university departments or even student groups with one faculty lead. So this is a very innovative model for doing space, and it's percolating down to quite modest levels. But the billionaires lead the charge. And so we have obviously the most famous billionaires. We have Richard Branson, self-promoting Richard Branson. We always hear about him. Elon Musk likes a bit of press, so we hear about him too. Jeff Bezos is the dark horse, but he's got just as much skin in the game and just is a little more secretive. There's a board of 30 viable space companies, private space companies worldwide. Virgin Galactic had a serious setback with the loss of their prototype and the death of a co-pilot, near death of a pilot, and they were heavily dinged on their procedures and safety protocols, and so they had to go back to the drawing board, and they're still saying 2021 for their new launches, but I don't think anyone really believes that. It's more like 2022. But it's also worth remembering that the Branson has taken $50 million worth of deposits. And I think the most telling thing about Virgin Galactic was that after that catastrophe with a death, fatality, he offered everyone who put down a deposit their money back, no questions asked, and only a handful took it. So that tells me that people doing this, these are civilians, of course, putting their money down. There's a list of celebrities, of course, included in that, movie stars and TV stars. They know it's risky. And so the risks are clear to the people who want to do this in the first stage of the game. And we know that whether or not any of us feel it individually in our portfolios or bank accounts, the number of billionaires in the world is growing quite rapidly, and their net worth is growing incredibly rapidly. We know even since the pandemic that billionaires have done extremely well. And there's a spaceport in New Mexico. There's a lot of infrastructure being built for this next phase of the activity. Here's the Bezos operation, Blue Shepard, and his Blue Moon prototype. Again, not getting as much publicity as Elon Musk, who's a publicity hound, but in truth, as I'm sure you know, technically and in terms of their achievements so far, SpaceX and Blue Origins are essentially neck and neck. They're doing the same thing. They obviously have different designs, but they're both at the leading edge of the curve. And that fierce competition between them is actually helping this all move along very fast. To get a sense of the scale again, the next generation of SpaceX launchers is going to be really impressive. I mean, it's just, you can see from the bottom view that he's just scaling up his rocket designs and nesting a lot of them together. But you're finally going to eclipse the mighty Saturn V rocket in the next generation. So this is a lot of innovation, a lot of ambition, and people are going to die. We know that. It's dangerous. This curve here is the fatality rate per million departures of civil aviation since the Second World War through the 90s or through the 2000s. The circles, I'm not going to identify all of them, but the circles are significant changes in safety procedures, pressurization, redundant avionics, etc. And so there's been a decline in the fatality rate of civil aviation by a factor of 100. And so the model of civil aviation works, not just the Lindbergh Prize as a model for what was the X, which of course spurred civil aviation in the 1930s. But just the fact that you can do something that's risky and then still develop a business model that projects to really large revenues in the future. And so, and then as I mentioned with the Virgin Galactic disaster, people, even civilians and just people recreationally going into space, will accept that there's a risk. The economics are quite substantial. I think that economics are viable. Here's the growth in the number of billionaires in the world. Branson and Musk have each spent of order $500 million out of their personal fortune, not liquidating stock or anything else, but what they're just their real money on this. And there's plenty of billionaires to fuel this activity. Now, down the curve, I've been giving surveys to when I teach a big class at the university, not this semester, but generally, I do polls of the students on space and what they think about going into space and in particular, I ask them a series of questions about what fraction of their income for a year they would spend on like a once in a lifetime trip to Earth orbit for a few days or something like that. And then I build that into a business model based on that generation, sort of millennials. And if you do that, you know, just projecting to the 22 million college-age students in the US, you generate an economic activity that's roughly $15 to $20 billion a year. That's the same size as the Hollywood before the pandemic, their box office sales or DVD sales. So you've absolutely, you know, fairly reliably project an economic activity that rivals Hollywood fairly soon. And so I think the business models are not flaky. They're obviously still depending on, you know, some future success and technical hurdles being achieved. So when I really wanted to analogize this, I went into databases. I couldn't find this. Of course, NASA doesn't even have the data well enough pulled together, so I had to go to Wikipedia, of course. So I trawled a bunch of data on films and space, you know, space missions of all kinds, and I plotted the median, not the average because it gets skewed, the median price per launch in space and movies over the whole history of the space era. And what you find is that a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, they crossed. The movies are now more expensive than the average space mission, which is interesting. And when I want to make this comparison super direct, I just point out to people that if you had $400 million burning a hole in your pocket, you could either make a really cool movie by a great director about life on an exomoon, or you could design the space mission that found 400 Earth-like planets. They cost the same. And when people are wondering why we spend money on science or space missions, I point to that example. Nothing wrong with Avatar. I loved it. It's a great movie, very expensive. We should have both. They're fine. And so the analogizing of space travel with entertainment, with recreation, with tourism, I think is legitimate. It's not all it's going to be about, but it's clearly going to be about that at some level. And that's what the business models look at. There's a part of this that's not been developed that sort of languished, and that's the law, because the space activity was dominated by a couple of governments for so long, and their geopolitical interests were quite clear, and they had ways diplomatically of working this out, that the space law aspect has sort of languished a bit. There have only been 2 international space treaties. The Outer Space Treaty of '67 was, of course, really important because it banned weapons in space and was signed by most of the world. There's a few rogue states that never signed it, but all the major powers did. However, the Moon Treaty was the one that dealt with ownership and commercial activity, was signed by very few countries, I think only about 19, and not by the US, not by any of the major space players. And both of these treaties are really designed to deal with state actors and don't mention commercial property or private ownership at all. They're mute to that. So there's a whole sector of law that is, as we speak, gradually being developed or worked out, but the UN as an international body hasn't really touched this, or they've had committees working on it that take forever and don't really do much. So there's a lot of unresolved stuff going on in the space arena in the legal domain, and that's sort of work that actually needs to be done for all of this to work in practice. And it's not clear how that will work. I'll point out that, you know, although most people get excited about people in space and we want it to be about us, obviously, that's where the evocative ideas of our human destiny come into play. When it's us doing this, the miniaturization and you know, Moore's law advances of semiconductor technology and computers have driven an incredible, I'm using Feynman's phrase here, room at the bottom. In the miniaturized realm, CubeSats and miniature technologies are incredibly effective in lowering the bar for going into Earth orbit. So again, we're talking undergraduate student groups, $10,000 a launch. You put them together, you bunch up the CubeSats, and you can get a launch. And if you attach a solar sail to them, you can start to move around the solar system quite efficiently. And these things are happening now. What you can get into a tiny package of maybe only 10 grams sometimes now is truly impressive. You can get the microprocessor, you can get some solar cells, you can get antennae, you can get a little radio transmitter. So this is booming, and you can see the curve. It's not fully current, only up to 2019, but the curve is almost exponential in CubeSat launches. A slightly more discouraging aspect of this for an astronomer is the rise of the what we call fleets of satellites, constellations of satellites that are designed mostly to enable high-speed internet in places that don't have it. So I'm torn on this topic because, of course, SpaceX is heavily involved, but there's several consortia doing this. SpaceX has been doing a lot of launches recently. It's not a purely altruistic activity. Of course, there's a strong commercial motivation behind it, but the idea of giving the 2 billion people in the world who don't have wireless internet access, of high bandwidth access, is a huge democratizing force in the world for that to happen. So I totally approve that, and I'm in favor of it. The flip side, unfortunately, is that these low Earth orbit satellites are bright enough that they are essentially going to ruin the images taken by the upcoming generation of sky survey telescopes, like the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. That's one that we built the mirror for at the Mirror Lab in the University of Arizona, and it's now called the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, national project, international actually. So all the future deep sky surveys are going to be heavily compromised for some periods of time, dawn and dusk, of course, mostly, by the reflections off these satellites. They leave huge scoring trails littered across a frame, a deep CCD frame. And there's been this little delicate negotiation. I was at the American Astronomical Society meeting in Hawaii back when we were still traveling in January. And there was a special session on these satellite constellations. And there was a pretty senior SpaceX representative. We didn't get Elon there, but, and it was delicate. It was a little contentious because there were a lot of astronomers in the room, and the radio astronomers are being affected by some of this in a different way. And on SpaceX have done their part by experimenting with new, matte black coatings for the satellites to reduce their reflectivity, but they're not backing off on their goals of tens of thousands of these satellites. You can see the projection to 2027. So the number of low Earth orbit satellite arrays or fleets, the total number of them is going to increase far beyond the history of everything that came before. And this essentially is going to happen. I don't think astronomers can slow it down or stop it. So it's another part of this activity. And if you're going to take the big picture view, here again is the long history, the last 40 years of cost per launch into low Earth orbit, cost per kilo. And it gives you a sense of what's happening. And if you look, the SpaceX alone has driven the cost per kilo down by an order of magnitude from 10,000 to 1,000 per kilo in 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. That's dramatic. That's very impressive. These are difficult technologies, and as we all know, they're not really innovating in a fundamental sense. SpaceX rockets are, of course, just cousins, maybe distant cousins of Saturn V. They're the same fundamental chemical technology that, as we all know, is 100 million times less efficient than fusion power or some other power source that we might eventually hope rockets are powered by. So this is sort of huge optimization through reusability, of course, of the launch vehicles, huge optimization of a pretty old technology. And he thinks, and Bezos and the others doing this still think there's more to wring out of this. And so that blue curve is, the pundits' estimate of how this will continue to go down. NASA is part of this, of course, now. NASA has sort of been reduced to a sort of cheering partner and a collaborator of these big companies, dishing out multi-billion-dollar contracts to several of the space companies that pretty much kept them going in their phase when they weren't generating revenues otherwise. So it's a useful partnership between the private sector and the NASA entity. So is it going to continue? Is it going to project down another order of magnitude this decade? That would be interesting. That would absolutely bring the space tourism and recreation thing into full view for middle-class people, not rich people. So this is where we're headed. And then eventually, if we ever got to a space elevator, of course, game on, because that essentially makes low Earth orbit free. And my, I'm going to not talk too much longer so we can have discussion. Again, taking the big view of this, I've made, and this may be forced in some aspects because, but not everyone is familiar with the history of the internet either. So it's useful for me to frame both histories. So I've analogized the history of the internet and the history of space flight into 4 phases. There's a pioneering phase. I don't know how many of you know the name of the person in the black and white photo. That's J.R. Licklider. He was an analyst at the RAND Corporation, and in 1960, he wrote a white paper fully envisaging the wireless internet, data in the cloud, microsatellites transmitting data. I mean, an almost unimaginable feat of vision at a time when a mainframe computer was the size of a family house. So these are the pioneers. He's the visionary of the internet, if you like, if you wanted to pick one person. Then you have a phase where there's incubation by the military industrial complex. So those of us who've been in academia a long time know that our first email accounts came, usually working with people in doing research with government agencies who had access to internet, the DARPANET and so on. These were the first implementation of the internet, the development of it, and then of course it moves into the R&D realm, and CERN is the home of the browser, the first web browser, and so on. These are all well-known stories. And then in 1995, it makes this phase transition into warp drive, if you like, of going into the commercial sector. And again, that's so long ago that when I teach, of course, there are kids, when you say to an 18 or 20-year-old, imagine a time when there was no internet, they look at you like you're from Mars or even further away, because that's inconceivable to them. And I can remember it, of course. And we all tend to forget that in 1995, it really was very sudden. A company with a strange name called Amazon was founded. The first internet service providers went into business. And 2 grad students at Stanford got together to think about search, and that became Google. That all happened in 1995. And I really would challenge any one of us, because we were all around then, to have been there in 1995 noticing these stories and predicted where we would be in 2020. I think it's very hard to do. That's how fast the progress has been. But obviously the commercial internet activity is now a $5 or $6 trillion a year enterprise in just a couple of decades. And so to complete that analogy, we are familiar with the pioneering phase, when Robert Goddard sent his little chemical rocket 180 yards across Aunt Effie's frozen cabbage patch in the Midwest on a winter's morning. Could he really envisage Saturn V going to the moon? I don't know, but he was a pioneer. We have the incubation by the military industrial complex, also familiar to all of us. And there's some little, it's not a story that can be retold with too much gloss, because we probably most of you also know the extreme awkwardness. I'm a Brit, so this is a little more visceral for me because I had relatives who died in this. That Werner von Braun's Mittelwerk rocket plant producing the V2 rockets led to the death of 7,000 or 8,000 people in London, including one of my relatives, and about the same number of slave workers in that factory. But he was spirited off at the end of the war to become part, his Nazi record was completely sanitized and scrubbed. The American public had no idea about all that stuff afterwards, and he became the architect of our venture to the moon. So that's a slightly ugly in retrospect to tell that story fully and honestly, but that's sometimes how the sausages get made. And then we move into the research arena, and it becomes, we'll give our kudos in 1959 to the president who was a full-on military man, Dwight Eisenhower, who, when NASA was founded, remember, right at the inception of the Cold War, he had a choice. He had enormous pressure on him to make NASA an agency that would do military development work and deal with, and project weapons in space and so on. And he, mostly by his own good instincts, he held back against that, and he made NASA a civilian agency with open books and open accounting and reporting to Congress. That was, Dwight Eisenhower did that. It didn't have to be that way. So that was the branding of NASA from its start. And that was, I think, a great thing that he did, a wonderful thing. And so NASA did what it did, and we can bemoan the expense and inefficiency and the loss of life of the space shuttle, or the international pork barrel nature of the $130 billion and counting space station. But NASA did some good things too. And so I'm going to, obviously, as you can see, I'm going to project that at some point we go through that phase transition to the commercial era. And it's not as dramatic, it's not as punctuated as 1995 for the internet, but I really think it could be now. I mean, it's right around now. It's as we watch, it's happening. And similarly, I will defy any of us or myself to predict what we're going to be seeing in 20 or 25 years. It's moving that fast, which is exciting. So after, you could say being in the doldrums for a while, from the young people who say, you went to the moon 50 years ago and you've never been back, what's with that? I would counter with what's happening right now. And if you want just a numerical measure of the future being here, just look at the fact that 2016 was the first year in the history of the space program, and you can see the ebb and flow of the American and Russian efforts and the growth of China and the various other commercial operations through the 80s and 90s. But 2016 was the first year there were more commercial launches than government launches, and it's probably going to just stay that way into the future. And then I'll finish with just a couple of comments about things that are on the horizon. So we can project what's happening now to a near future. I think that's fairly reliable. The business plans are out there, and we can guess what they are. So we know what's on the horizon. Like I said, the commercialization of space is a little awkward because there are no rules. It's a Wild West. Well, most of us live in the Wild West, so we're kind of okay with that probably. There's no rules against commercialization. There's no, just astronomers have to deal with this all the time because we're dealing with sky pollution of the night sky, and we don't really have any, there's no way we could ban people putting huge reflecting things in Earth orbit for advertising purposes. There's no way to do it. So, some of this is going to be a little ugly. There's going to be space sex hotels in orbit. Just think of it. This is a slightly below the bar comment, but and I've read an article about this in the Atlantic. It was quite amusing. But almost every major technology and innovation in the modern world, the leading edge of that has been sex or pornography industry, pushing the envelope. And why would we actually think space is different? So there'll be an unseemly aspect to some of this too. But then there's some amazing stuff that might happen. The Indian rope trick of a space elevator, that actually cannot be done on the Earth at the moment. We simply do not have materials. Take your very best, carbon fiber nanotube technology, and it does not have the tensile strength to make a space elevator on the Earth. However, it does, with current technology and plans that are quite mature, they were going to project to about $10 billion cost, we could do it on the moon. And so a lunar elevator is completely on the cards, and that it doesn't solve all your problems, of course, but it really starts to point back to the moon. People got bored with the moon. Now everyone wants to go to Mars and forget the moon. But I think the moon is going to be the epicenter of this industrialization of space, because with a lunar elevator, which could be built today, and literally a $10 billion capital project is not even that expensive, shared by companies who have an interest in this. That sort of enables your mastery of the solar system long term. And that's just going to be a huge game changer. So I think that is going to happen. I don't know when, and I've seen various ideas about when it might happen and who might do it. Obviously, we need a foothold on the moon before we can seriously do that. But all the technologies for building habitats on the moon and Mars, they're really retro. I mean, you can make, you can use lunar and Martian soil to make rocket fuel and oxygen to breathe, and slump block to build your hardened habitats. That is all easy stuff. That's not even very visionary. That's mundane, scalable technology. So I think it's going to happen. And then we get into the issues of mining asteroids. Again, that's another thing that will probably happen. You know, we know the danger of this kind of thing. If you get out too far in front, like the Bunker brothers with silver back in the 70s, you know, you develop a new way to get a lot of valuable commodity and corner the market and crater the market, then you're going to have a problem. But once again, the technology for us to identify a near-Earth asteroid and alter it into a captured Earth-Moon orbit, it's rocket science of the kind that we absolutely know how to do. And then you develop your mining activity from a sort of captured metal-rich, rare earth-rich asteroid. And that, again, can be done. Also, you need water in space. Water is a rare and valuable commodity. To ship it from the Earth is 20,000 a liter. It's not something we want to do very much. And so we're going to have to get water in situ when we go into space to do these activities, just like we'll need oxygen in situ for people to be out there. And that's not too hard either. So all these things are doable. They're, I think, on a near-ish horizon, and I think they're going to happen. So when people ask me, where are we in the space activity after maybe these times when we're in the doldrums, I just think we're at the end of the beginning. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chris. We've had a couple of comments come in that I'd like to have you riff on. For one thing, we've got one of our participants who was able to complete one of your online courses.
Oh, that's great. Yes.
Can you tell us, are those ongoing? What's going on with
Yes. So I have 2 classes with Coursera, and they're free. You pay and get a certificate, but the courses themselves are free. One's called Astronomy Exploring Time and Space, and that's just a survey of astronomy. And then I have a more recent one just put up about 2 years ago, which is astrobiology, and that's called Astrobiology: Exploring Other Worlds. So they're both running on Coursera, and I'm actually I'm going to put up a third this year, which is a course I'm teaching right now at the U of A, and I just got into it enough that I thought I'll do a MOOC, which is a history and philosophy of astronomy, so a little different flavor.
I've also seen your YouTube, I don't know what it's called, but you answer questions about virtually anything space related that I found fascinating.
Right. We do those sessions every week, and we get, some weeks we get 200 people online from around the world. So yeah, I answer questions. And what's always weird to me is that those live sessions go on YouTube, and they're just, questions about astronomy and space answered in, on any topic, answered in the order they come. And yet some of them have 1,000 views. And I'm trying to imagine who has so much time that they can watch a random ordering of questions about astronomy. But, so I'll mention my solution to that. I mean, clearly some people are looking at them anyway. I am working with a programmer, and we developed a pipeline to chop up those videos and do AI, some level of AI pattern matching, so that you could, in a web browser, type in your question, whatever it is, and it would match you to the best hits against thousands of questions that have been asked over 6 years, and return it as a little chunk of sound or video. So we're working on that, which would be a more efficient way to answer questions.
Excellent. I'm going to jump into a couple of curiosities that I have before I introduce some other people that wanted to ask questions. One of the news reports I've seen say that there have been about 45 asteroids that have come within the lunar orbit this year. Is that an excessive number, or are we just seeing them because we're looking now?
Yeah, it's not and it's a normal number where our capabilities are improving. So, I mean, the big picture on that is that NASA was tasked by Congress to find everything that might hit the Earth that's bigger than 140 meters by this year, essentially, and they pretty much succeeded. So those are the big ones. Those same sky surveys are pretty efficient at detecting things down to about 30, 40, 50 meters, which could still obviously ruin your day. But also the number of surveys is increased because now we have amateurs and robotic telescope networks. So the, you know, the survey capability has just increased a lot in the last decade, in particular for moving objects. And, you know, those, just the sheer capability is giving us sensitivity to smaller, closer things that, you know, down to 5 or 10 meters. And so we're seeing things that we knew were there and have always been there, and we're just picking them up.
Okay. Now I understand that directive from Congress was defined as the Near Earth Object Survey Mission.
Right.
And the University of Arizona was involved with that. Is that correct, with Amy Mines with the lunar and planetaries?
Yeah, well, there's two things. Before Amy we hired Amy from, she was at NASA, I guess, just a year ago, and she brought a mission with her. Before that, we had the Catalina Sky Survey on Mount Lemmon. So we've had surveys doing this work for a decade, you know, for the whole decade, starting when NASA was told, given money by Congress to do it. So we've had one of the 4 or 5 surveys that have been doing the heavy lifting for 10 years. The new survey, her project, is taking us down to 50 meters, 40 or 50 meters with some completeness and reliability. And that's a pretty big niche, because the number, you know, these are logarithmic distributions of size. So there's 10 or 20 times more things that she's going to pick up, or her survey will pick up, than were picked up by the first generation of surveys. So it's an ongoing task. And just as with the big stuff, so I'm sure you may know there's the website, of course, that tracks the first wave of surveys, the big stuff, and does orbital elements. And if it has any kind of probability of proximity, then they observe it more, throw another telescope or 2 at it, get more orbital elements, home in the orbital projection. And there's a Torino scale of probability of impact on the far right, and they color code it. And it's kind of fun to go to that website and watch things occasionally go from green to orange to yellow. But then almost always they go back to green, because of course space is big, and as soon as they get the orbit more accurately, they realize, well, it's going to come quite close, but it's going to miss. So they'll be doing the same thing now with Amy's survey.
I believe Al Zaldua has a question he'd like to share.
Yeah, I have a question, but also just a quick, well, I guess this is a question too. I really loved your diagram showing the falling launch costs, and I was thinking, gosh, I'd like to have that for my own talks. So I hope you can share where you got that slide, or share it directly.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's not my question that I had. As you were talking about this coming exponential growth of satellites being launched, I was thinking about orbital debris. And last time, and same way with the space elevator, although it seems like it's much more feasible on the moon. You know, last time I checked, there were over 8,000 tons of orbital debris up there. Do you have any thoughts about what to do about that?
Well, that's a huge problem, and then it's been getting some attention belatedly. There's good news as far as these constellations go. The good news is that they have planned obsolescence built into them. They're so low Earth orbit that their orbits degrade. So they're essentially disposable, you know, so they're having to launch, you know, when they get to their steady state, they're still going to have to launch dozens or maybe 100 a year just to keep the constellation intact and high enough density. But they will all fall out and burn naturally, because they're in so low Earth orbit. That was by design, and because the power of their, you know, transmitters is modest. So it was a multiple constraint situation, but that's a happy outcome. So I would say the constellations are screwing up deep sky research astronomy, but they're not going to contribute to the space debris problem long term. The debris problem in mid-Earth orbit, you know, the 200 to the, you know, from the space shuttle and space station regime is bad, and there's no, it's not getting better, of course. And and there are no, electromagnetic space scoops, and there's all sorts of design studies I've seen. It's just hard. I mean, it's the density of it is just so low. So I haven't really seen a nice solution to that. It's sort of like the people who are trying to scoop up plastic from the world's oceans. It's a very analogous problem, and they're having a lot of trouble with that too. So unfortunately, I don't have a good rosy prognosis for space debris.
Phyllis wants to ask a question as well.
Oh, I was saying the same thing. I want a copy of some of your slides. So that was a really good analogy how you had that all put out. So that's all I was saying.
Sure. Yeah, I think I can share. The ones that I don't have any, lock on any of the ones I made, like the analogy of internet and space and so on. That's fine. People can. I actually am remembering that logarithmic price curve that probably came from The Economist. So I'll put an attribution on it if I share it, because some of these I get from the internet, and when I'm just using them for live one-time performance, the copyright is a little looser.
I want to comment on your space elevator. I think it's very interesting, although there's some definite engineering problems with having a crawler go up and spend days to get from lunar surface to lunar orbit. Have 40 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, there was a brief discussion about the non-synchronous skyhook that would travel around, dip down to the surface, and pull it back up. It would only be good for cargo. You couldn't put humans on it because the accelerations would be too high.
Right.
Has there been any development of that concept?
Yeah, I was aware of that. I do occasional little scan out there of design studies and these things maturing at some level to a business plan, an actual viable thing. And I haven't seen anything very recent on that at all.
Okay.
Yeah, the space elevators, the two for a lunar elevator or for the Earth, if looking farther into the future. I mean, the engineers love this stuff because, I mean, the stability of it is a huge concern. It's an issue. It's a big issue. But there are all sorts of clever ideas now built into the design studies of how you really stabilize it in practice. And then, of course, the other issue, especially for the terrestrial one, is terrorism, sabotage. It's not just an obvious target at the point where you've sunk a couple of tens of billions of dollars into it. And I don't have there's no easy answer to that one. But again, it's as a capital project with some decade-long return on investment that's probably pretty substantial. It's really quite viable for, again, as a lunar project initially, but you need the infrastructure. So it is going to depend on government investment in a lunar base to develop enough infrastructure or capability that you could scale infrastructure to get you going on that, I think. And so neglecting the moon would lead to a longer time frame for that.
The extension of that, reducing the size, is the idea of momentum banks or mom banks. Where you could spread spinning satellites throughout the solar system, solar orbits, so that cargo could be basically flung from one mom bank to the next. Reducing the time to go across the solar system, and using solar power that is collected at the mom bank instead of having to use rockets. I also haven't seen anything develop on that, but that would be something that it could be commercially developed without government interaction.
And that addresses one of the biggest limitations of of solar sails, which is their really slow acceleration. I mean, it's not a quick way to get anything around the solar system, unfortunately.
Laura Wynn has a question, I believe.
Okay, so
All right.
I actually have a okay, the question that I have about small satellites is, so they're retrievable in a sense, or they fall out of orbit. But what happens if they collide with each other?
Right. You mean the constellations, the
Yeah,
SpaceX?
constellations.
Yeah.
Constellations crossing each other somehow.
Right. Again, once they've been deployed and dispersed to their, their webbed orbits designed to give you full coverage across Africa and Asia of internet with the density you need, the odds of collisions are actually very small. I mean, I've seen one of the SpaceX studies. They don't make everything public, of course. The rate of collisions is less than the rate of loss due to friction and burning up in the atmosphere. So it's a pretty small attrition rate. It's completely within the spec of what they've designed for, because they're going to have to launch these a few hundred a year just to keep it going.
What about the impact of such a collision on the distribution of debris in orbit?
Well, they're in a very low Earth situation where there's significant drag, and so there is no long-term stability of debris in those orbits. So it's evanescence, transient debris always, including theirs. Their sort of stuff is space debris that's eventually going to come back down. That was pretty much how they designed it. It makes the launch costs less. It lowers the transmitter power requirement in each one, and so on. It just made the project viable. And once you've built up a technology that you can scale to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, it's marginal extra cost to put up more.
Is there any increase in risk to other payloads that have to go through those orbits or close to?
There's not a lot of long-term activity in that orbital range, so it's not a unique space or niche to them, but there's not a lot of stuff there for the same reason, that it's not long-term stable. As far as, yeah, I mean, they're actually not, because they're essentially they're sort of threading their coverage over areas that are almost by definition low population density, underdeveloped or developing countries without space programs or spaceports nearby. So it doesn't seem like there's a problem. I mean, these are all now non-zero risks that everyone is aware of, because the amount of stuff, debris at whatever orbit is just increasing steadily, and then as it collides with itself, that gets worse steadily. So none of this is going in a good direction. But
I'd like to add something to that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The problem really is when you get above around 400 kilometers and you get it around 600 kilometers. I mean, I don't have the chart in front of me right now, but 600, 700, 800 kilometers, right in there, you have a lot of debris. And, that's a really big problem area to begin with. And because the debris will take, depending on exact altitude, will take decades to centuries to millennia before it falls in the orbits on its own. And the big danger that I see about this debris is that it can ruin our dreams for larger structures like space solar satellites, for instance. Those are a space solar satellite. Well, I know that the most plans are for them to be in GEO, but GEO is not free of debris either. The relative velocities are lower because they have to stay in synchronous with the Earth's turning. But there's still large structures up there, and some of them are out of control. But other types of large structures that would be in low Earth orbit, but higher than a space station. Like, for instance, we're talking about free flyer space stations,
Mhm.
We all want to have orbiting fuel depots and shops for construction, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I see really big problems if we don't get rid of that debris. And most of the debris, most of the mass is, number one is Russian or Soviet Russian. Next is the US. And the third largest amount of debris is from China. And these actors are geopolitically at each other's throat very often. And yet, if they don't cooperate on this, they're not going to be able to get rid of this debris. So it's a geopolitical problem, and besides being quite a technical problem.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's like it's imagine you're in a war zone between three countries and you're supposedly in the DMZ trying to set up a big commercial enterprise while bullets are whizzing around you and you have to somehow handle that. That's right. It's at some point the visionary projections of the space activity and the infrastructure that will be needed in Earth orbit is going to collide with the reality of space debris and our inability or unwillingness to do anything about it. I mean, it is unwillingness at some level in the geopolitical part you allude to, but it's just technically also very challenging. I just haven't seen any real inroads into that technically in a plan, you know.
Speaking of large structures, the question was asked on chat as to what the image is behind me. That's the inside of the Stanford Torus as developed by Gerard O'Neill back in the early 70s. In your book, Chris, you mention that briefly and say that it is never going to happen because it's ruinously expensive. I'd like to point out that the Egyptians built the pyramids 3,000 years ago. So you want to defend your position?
Yeah, well, I won't defend the use of the word never. If I use that, that was hyperbolic because never is dangerous to say.
Okay.
And then in any case, I think it's going to take quite a long while because habitats of that scale. I mean, it's cheaper. I think, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine it's cheaper to create a Mars habitat to sustain that number of people than to do it in Earth orbit. I'm not sure, but it might be. If you had the infrastructure on Mars already, if you had, you know, robots, self-replicating robots and machine factories to build materials and create oxygen.
I just don't want to be tied to a planet.
No, that's true. Yeah.
It has been the hour that I promised. Would you like to give us any final words, Chris, before we go on to discussing? I'm going to turn it over to Ed Little in a few minutes about what current activities this month have been.
No, I'm happy to spend an hour with you, and I'm, you know, despite the obstacles and the things that seem hard or the space debris, which is a big problem, I'm a clear optimist for the future here. And also, you know, even the visionaries don't always know. You know, I'm sure you know the Arthur C. Clarke being asked when we'd have a space elevator, and he said 50 years after everyone stops laughing. Well, they've stopped laughing, so you know, these things do actually.
50 years, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, it was good to be with you. I thank you. Thanks for your questions too and your attention, and I hope to see you again in the future. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye.
Ed Little, we're going to turn it to you to bring us up to date on what's happened in space recently.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. I have a little PowerPoint. Let's see, so share screen.
I see it.
Okay. How does that look?
Beautiful. It says Space News, August
right.
29.
So first of all, let me just point out, I had the same slide last month, but I did add a couple of YouTube channels to it. There are a good number of really good YouTubers who are producing space news segments, typically several times per week. And it seems to be that the formula is keep it fairly short, 10 to 15-minute video, do it multiple times per week, sometimes 2 times, sometimes 3 times a week. They also will do live streams when there's a rocket launch or some kind of event going on. So I think these are really interesting. There are the links right there. If you would like, we can probably put this on our website or some way to let the other members access this. But it's a really good way to stay up to date with what's going on in space. It's entertaining, so it's a really good resource. I think a lot of young people, especially, rather than going to a club meeting or whatever, they might be more inclined to just tune in to their favorite YouTuber who's doing space news and just watch a 10-minute video a couple times a week and get caught up. Another thing to note is that probably for most of these channels here, about 2/3 of the news is SpaceX related. So kind of goes to show you how much SpaceX is driving the state of the art and making things happen in space. So for the actual news, I came up with a couple of a few events. There are literally things happening every day. So you could kind of go down and make a slide like this probably almost every single day. But I tried to hit the highlights. And these are all since our last meeting about a month ago. But first of all, NASA successfully launched the Perseverance Mars rover. And that joins 2 other nations sending rovers to Mars, or to missions to Mars. So China sent a orbiter and a lander to Mars during this window, and then the United Arab Emirates launched their own orbiter to Mars as well. So that's the first, I think that's the first interplanetary mission from an Arab nation. So it kind of goes to show you how space is becoming more open and accessible to non-traditional players. Second item on that list, and again, as I said, SpaceX is dominating in terms of creating major news events, but the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft came back to Earth successfully, returned Bob and Doug from the space station. And this, of course, is a huge event. The launch of the Crew Dragon spacecraft was, of course, the first commercial company to launch people into space. So it will probably be a turning point in human history, actually. And of course, it's all for nothing if they can't come back successfully. And they did come back successfully, and it was a great event. Third thing on that list, the Starship, SpaceX is continuing to develop their big launcher, their big rocket, Starship and Super Heavy. So I think in Chris's presentation, he kind of referenced ITS, which is for the older version of that. ITS stands for Interplanetary Transport Spacecraft, I believe. But that's a 12-meter version, whereas Starship and Super Heavy are 9-meter versions, but it's still going to be a very large spacecraft. They're going to be fully reusable. So the booster will come back much like the Falcon 9 first stage comes back, but then the Starship will be kind of like a mini, I won't say mini space shuttle, but it's actually bigger than a space shuttle. But it'll be an orbital class rocket that will go into space, do things in space, and then come back and land vertically and be completely reusable. So they've made 8 prototypes so far. And so number 5, I believe, was the one that completed a hop test, a flight test to about 500 feet a couple weeks ago. And they've already gotten another prototype ready to do another hop, and that's supposed to happen tomorrow. So tune into one of the links that I mentioned in the first page there. And they'll probably do a live stream of that flight test if it happens. We talked a lot about space debris and all these mega constellations that are being created. And in the last month, since our last meeting, there were 2 more SpaceX launches of the Starlink internet satellite constellation, and there is going to be another launch tomorrow. So that goes to show you how fast they are trying to deploy this constellation. And then I kind of mentioned the last one already, but SpaceX is continuing to build out their launch facilities in Boca Chica, Texas. They're building prototypes. Like I said, they'll do a test hop tomorrow, hopefully. But they're also building launch pads. There's a very large high bay being built down there to house the large boosters. So hard to say, but given their current rate, I wouldn't be surprised if they actually have an orbital launch sometime next year. They're moving very, very fast. And that's all I've got for space news. I'm going to unshare my screen now. Okay, Alex, it looked like you had a question or hand up.
Yes, I have a question. I want to comment first. That's an excellent presentation you just gave. Short and sweet, fact-filled. And I would like to share that with the National Space Society leadership, because there's a group to which I'm connected, which is trying to do outreach, and they don't have I don't think, quite a good feel yet for the competition and what really works. At least I think this would be, your presentation would be helpful to raise awareness in general and give them ideas to boot. So with your permission, Ed, I would like to keep that part of the presentation and pass it on. And in particular, aside from that, I would like to, if you would share your slides with me.
Sure, yeah, I'll email them to you.
And I thank you, and I will give you credit. But let me know if I can also share the whole recording as well.
Yeah, sure. I think the only thing I will add to that, and because I've been following a lot of these YouTubers for several years. I think the first one, TMRO, they've been around for probably close to a decade now. And they kind of started out philosophically, kind of like trying to do a TV news report, but just do it on the internet. And they morphed their format quite a bit. But again, it seems like what's really hot nowadays is the 10 or 15 minute video, and then doing it 2 or 3 times a week, and then cultivating a fan base. A lot of those folks have well over 100,000 subscribers. A lot of their videos have well over 10,000 views in the first day or so. So that gives you an idea of what a lot of them have sponsors. So it's quite possible to be a full-time YouTuber and make a decent living off of it. Now, how NSS is able to contribute to that, I think at this point it's almost, it's a pretty well-developed market, and I don't know, there's a lot of overlap, as well with what those YouTubers are saying. So it's probably not worthwhile to watch all 5 of those channels. Because again, there's a lot of overlap, but but it shows you that there's enough interest out there that you can have several viable channels out there doing space news. And of course, SpaceX is driving a lot of the news because they're just doing stuff all the time. So,
well, NSS leadership is now starting to put out some of their, or work on some of their own videos as well, and NSS has a YouTube channel. So I just think that, what you just said, plus what your earlier report would be of great value to us, to me and others, about where we can carve out a niche, perhaps. Right. With all that competition, we have to figure out a way to stand out, of course.
Sure, and you guys, the NSS did do the Day in Space live stream a month and a half ago, or whatever, and I saw most of it, and actually that was very well done. So I think, you know, there is the capacity to have good content. A lot of content was actually not just, you know, here's what's going on, you know, this week kind of stuff, you know, the episodic kind of stuff. It's actually really good, deep content. It talked about exoplanets. It talked about, you know, some things in space development. So, you know, that stuff that's not going to be done by the SpaceX fanboys. So if I could give any advice, I would say, go back and look at what you guys all did for the Day in Space and try to, like, maybe if you can make that into something that's more like a weekly podcast or whatever, that might be a good place to go where you're not duplicating effort by other YouTubers.
Sounds like good advice. Thanks.
I guess all I've got.
Is there anybody else who'd like to add something before I stop the recording? No? Okay. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm going to leave the meeting going and unmute everybody. So if you guys want to talk among yourselves, you go right ahead until you're done. So